Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, how the hack of DigiNotar changed the internet forever, changing the way we think about security, and hiding malware in a PNG. Plus, a ton of your emails, a big roundup, and a packed 300th episode of TechSNAP. Hi, everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 300 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly systems network and administration podcast. We stream this episode live on January 5th, 2017. This episode is brought to you by our three fine sponsors, Ting, DigitalOcean, and IX Systems. I'll tell you more about those great sponsors as this here show goes on. Our live stream, why that's powered by the incredible Scale Engine over at scaleengine.com. You should really go check that out. My name is Chris, and joining us for 300 weeks without ever missing a beat is our host, the admin, the tech, and the teacher, Mr. Alan Jude. Hello, Alan.
Hello, Chris, everybody.
Thanks hey, man. Watching. Happy freaking 300, Alan. April 18th, 2011 is when we started this show.
Yeah, and now it's 2017.
I know. You know what, Alan? Part of me feels like one of my kids is graduating. Like they're moving out of the house and going on to bigger and better things, starting their life. Like it's like something we've been doing since 2011, Alan.
I know. I think almost everything else in my life has changed since 2011.
Yeah, same here, man. Big time. I started in my garage. I was doing this show in my garage when we started.
And I was in my apartment.
Yeah.
And then I bought a house. I quit working at the college.
Yeah, right. You were still at the college back then.
Went full time.
Yeah. Right. That's really something. That is really something. And we celebrated with the exclusive Patch Your Shit t-shirt, still available. It has tips now, so they are shipping, so you can get one. Available till January 13th, teespring.com/patchyourshit. It's a classic now with tote bags and stickers.
Yep.
Oh, and the hoodie. The hoodie actually right now would be nice because it's like when I woke up this morning, it was 15 degrees, and I think it's like 19 degrees out here now. So a hoodie would be the perfect for this kind of weather. Alan, now we could have just, I suppose, phoned it in for our last episode. For those of you that don't know, Alan and I are stepping down after this episode and being replaced by new fresh blood. Wes and Dan will be stepping in to take our roles, and we'll do a great job, I'm sure. And I thought for sure. This is going to be the one. It's going to be the one. Alan's going to phone it in. We're not going to have anything prepared. And then I looked at our first story, and if I'm not mistaken, I think
it's as long as some of our show docs.
Yeah, it's like 4 pages. The first story is like 4 pages of notes. So, yeah. And not only that, but it touches on a story that goes back to the very beginning of TechSNAP. Yep. So it's kind of perfect, Alan. Where do we start?
Yeah, it kind of wraps up. So this is how the hack of DigiNotar changed the infrastructure of the internet forever.
Wow.
So this goes back to TechSNAP episode 22 from September 8th of 2011. So that'd be like just after my birthday of the first, my first birthday on the show, basically.
Yeah, 6 years ago, it was just in the first run of TechSNAP. Wow.
Yeah, we basically this is only our 22nd episode, and we're still finding our feet, I think, a bit. And I remember, especially even just during the first 10 weeks or so, TechSNAP wasn't, none of the letters stood for security.
Right.
It was just going to be the sysadmin podcast.
That's very true.
Sysadmin things.
That's very true.
But the stories that happened to keep coming up and the things people wanted the explanations for, kind of always leaned towards it was, the Sony hack, the Dropbox hack, and then DigiNotar, and it's like everything.
Cyber is cyber threats, cyber security, cyber risk, cyber is.
But back then cyber still meant sex.
Exactly. That's my point. Like, this show has watched the transition of that term, has watched how how it's gone from not an industry where guys like me were contractors doing penetration testing for companies, and now there's companies like FireEye out there. I mean, it has blown up as an entire industry. It's been really something to watch.
Yeah, penetration testing and so on went from being undervalued to being startup valued at $1 billion.
Yes. It's very well put. Yeah. And DigiNotar was kind of right there for it all. It's one of the first ones that people really took interest in too. It was one of these stories where like Google got involved. There's a lot of like people going, what just happened?
Exactly. So on Saturday, August 27th, 2011, an Iranian man who just wanted to log into his Gmail found he couldn't connect to Gmail. But the problem disappeared when he connected to a VPN that disguised his location. Whatever was going on, it seemed to only affect computers in Iran. So his first hunch was that the problem was somehow tied to the Iranian government, which is known for interfering with online activities, or it might have been a problem with his ISP. So the user posted a question about the issue on the Google Help Forum. 2 days later, Google responded to this apparently small problem in a big way. It issued a public statement about the incident, attributing the problem to a security issue at a Dutch company called DigiNotar. Within a month, DigiNotar had been taken over by the Dutch government. Long after that, it declared bankruptcy and was dissolved.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity breaches don't usually spell the end of companies, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have, Sony, Target, Home Depot, and all these other places. It's highly unusual that, being hacked involves the company going out of business, much less spurring national governments to seize control of private firms. But the DigiNotar compromise was unusual in many ways. Usually, the cybersecurity incidents we read about involve a company failing to protect the information entrusted to it by users. But DigiNotar was different. Its whole reason for existing was to be able to tell internet users who and what they could trust. And in 2011, it failed spectacularly at that mission. And this sparked a radical shift in the way a lot of things are done on the internet. Suddenly, the archaically maintained list of certificate authorities started to be scrutinized.
Yeah.
That list, for a long time, had just come with your operating system and nobody even thought about it. Right? It was just a list that Microsoft made, or that you got from the Mozilla people, and you didn't really think about it. And back then it often included like quasi-government controlled agencies. At some point it was like, well, we need a certificate authority for people to get from every different country, and a lot of those ended up being the governments of those countries, and that was fine for a while. And over the years, after 2000 or so, it started to tend more towards those being commercial entities because, hey, certificates are something you can sell. And because, at some point, does the Dutch government really trust what the, Malaysian government says is okay?
Right.
And this was kind of part of the problem with the certificate authority system was, so here's a list of people we trust and anything they say goes, works fine if you can trust all those people. But, if you're Malaysian, maybe you do or maybe you don't trust the Malaysian government, right? But, if you're a different country, how do you decide what to trust?
Yeah. Yeah. And you've also seen like vendors of certain machines would sometimes insert their own systems into the list. Yep. So they'd be like modified versions. A lot of that was discovered.
Or even on Windows in particular, your domain controller is added to the trust list as soon as you join the domain. Right. So that's the entire basis of Active Directory is that trust relationship. So now we needed a better way to police the actions and procedures of these certificate authorities because the security of almost all of our systems depend on them, right? We use that for online banking. We use it to make sure that the updates we're downloading for our operating system are legitimate. All these other things.
Actually, I think in the case of iOS too, they even check before the app launches on iOS. Like it actually checks the validity of the certificate of the app developer before the app starts on the platform.
Yeah, well, that happens with signed executables on Windows as well. When you get that UAC pop-up and it says the company's name, that's because it looked at the certificate. You'll notice the pop-up looks different if it doesn't have a certificate. And it actually, most people have never seen it, but it looks even different when it's a revoked certificate. The point of the certificate authority is to certify with authority that the system you're connecting to actually belongs to your bank and not the Russian mafia. And, whatever the certificate's for. But in general, in HTTPS, what it's used for is that the website you're talking to proves via being certified by this authority that they are actually the real PayPal or the real your bank or the real Google and not somebody pretending to be them. Because without that, anybody can pretend to be anybody. if you're on, if you can intercept somebody's connection, say because it's on Wi-Fi, or you can splice into Ethernet cable or whatever, then you can make it so when they go to a website, they get a phishing version of that website. Even though they typed in the right domain, used a bookmark or whatever, you can do that. But HTTPS is what's supposed to prevent that.
Yeah, but anytime you're on somebody else's network and they can do that, you always tell yourself, well, if I'm on public Wi-Fi at the coffee shop, well, I'm using SSL. I'm fine. I'm using HTTPS everywhere I go. Okay. This is an example of where that wouldn't have protected you potentially.
Yeah. So your browser or operating system usually gives them this authority, right? They basically, there's a root trust store that's built into your browser or your operating system, and it provides the list of authorities that are trusted, and then those authorities can subdelegate to other, intermediate authorities and issue certificates saying that we've checked, and yes, that website is actually your bank, not somebody else. So they're basically the certificate authorities are like countries, and they're issuing passports. Right? And it's saying that, this passport says that the country of Canada certifies that that is actually Alan Jude and not somebody else. Right? And it's got a little picture instead of a fingerprint, or, some of them actually do have fingerprints or whatever to back that up. But, each country has to decide which countries they're willing to trust the passports from. Like in Canada, we don't respect passports from Somalia. It's like we don't really know who's the government there. Do they even issue passports? Are they legitimate? It's like, no, if it's a passport from Somalia, we just be like, sorry, no. And it's basically that list of what passports you'll trust is basically how the certificate authority system works on your browser. And, as we've seen, you can add things to that, right? So we've seen, Lenovo at one point was adding a certificate authority to that trust. And intercepting all Google searches and injecting extra ads into them. Or companies have devices that do this so that they can check for viruses going back and forth, even in an encrypted connection. Or also, make sure you're not doing things you're not supposed to do at work or whatever. Anyway.
No.
So, moving on. 5 years later, the story of DigiNotar's demise is all but forgotten, right? Imagine most people really hadn't thought about DigiNotar until I mentioned it a couple minutes ago. Eclipsed by a series of more recent, more easily understandable, and more exciting breaches, right? We've had, Target, Sony, Ashley Madison, and all these other ones. But DigiNotar's case has had long-standing impacts, motivating some much-needed improvements in the security of our online trust infrastructure, including a new set of minimum security requirements that companies like DigiNotar and all the other certificate authorities have to follow, that were announced earlier this month by the Certificate Authority Security Council. And also, we've also covered in the past the work of the CA/B, which is the Certificate Authority Browser Forum, where the certificate authorities in the browsers come up with, the browsers say, all right, if you want to be on our trust store, here's the list of things you have to do. And you have to promise that after this date, any certificate you issue will be at least this strong. So, because we're going to phase out the old, like anything based on MD5 or SHA-1 or less than 2048 bits and so on. But things still happen, right? In 2015, a root CA operated by the China Internet Information Center issued an intermediate certificate to one of its customers. That intermediate certificate was then used to issue certificates that were used to perform man-in-the-middle attacks and potentially intercept traffic between users and websites. So they'd issue a fake certificate for Google, and because they had the private key, they would be able to decrypt the traffic that your browser was encrypting between you and the fake Google, which they would then, so you would connect to their fake Google with an encrypted connection, but one they could decrypt, and then they would make the connection to real Google and pass stuff back and forth, but they would be able to see the unencrypted version of everything in the middle.
Right.
That's how a man in the middle works. Any one of these trusted CAs, whether they're a root CA or an intermediate CA, has been endorsed, can then issue certificates for any website they choose, even websites that chosen to buy their certificates from somewhere else. Right. So Google buys their certificates from VeriSign or somebody, but that doesn't stop the Chinese CA from issuing certificates for them, which can be a bad thing. So to address this, there's been a push for a system called certificate transparency, where every certificate, as it's issued by these CAs, is pushed into immutable logs kept by third parties. One of them is kept by Google. So Google Chrome began using certificate transparency for all newly issued extended validation certificates. That's the one that turns the bar green.
Mm-hmm.
So they've made certificate transparency a requirement for the green bar ones. So if Google Chrome sees a certificate that doesn't show up in any of its logs as ever being issued, it automatically rejects it, even though it's a valid certificate from a certificate authority. Because if the certificate authority isn't willing to publicly admit that they issued that certificate, then it's probably not one we want to trust.
You think that's something that'll be like they'll set a trend there?
Yeah, so I think at this point that's because it's mandated by Google to be trusted by Chrome. It's basically every certificate authority that issues the extended validation certificates is going to have to do this, and so that means that Firefox and so on can follow suit. And also, remember we talked about when Symantec screwed up and Google was like, "We're going to untrust you unless you follow these new rules."
Yep.
So they've actually started requiring certificate transparency from all certificates newly issued by Symantec starting June 1st of 2016, after they found that Symantec had issued 187 certificates without the domain owners even asking for those. And, mostly this came up because Symantec issued some bogus certificates, said they had revoked them all, and then Google found, 100 more of them. And it's like, well, obviously, Symantec, you're not very good at figuring out what you've actually done. So now any certificate you don't publish to our public log proving that you made it, then we're not going to accept it. And I think eventually we will require this of all certificate authorities. There's also an interesting tool. Komodo, one of the other certificate authorities, has created a tool called crt.sh, which is the certificate search. It's a tool that you can go in and type in like a company's name or their domain name or some other fields in the certificate and search for any certificates that have been issued. So it combines a couple of things. It does the certificate transparency logs, but I think it also just combines logs, other projects like the, what's the EFF ones called? The SSL.
You're talking about
Observatory and a bunch of other ones.
I don't know.
So basically it compiles lists of like every SSL certificate that's ever been seen and where it was seen. So you can go in there and you can type in a domain name and it'll show you, we saw this certificate. It says it was issued and valid for these date ranges, and this is the first time we saw it, and all these things. And it shows kind of how useful certificate transparency can be. Because one of the other important things is because these are timestamped hashed logs, you can never go back and modify the log after it's been written. And because they're controlled by third parties, the certificate authority has no way to, decide that actually we didn't want to issue that certificate, so we want to not make it look like we ever did. So they basically, if a certificate authority does screw up, they can't erase their tracks. It'll be obvious from this simple search of this website that they issued that certificate. So it provides a number of facets of security that we're going to get from this. First, your browser can check that the certificate that, you go to your bank and it sends you a certificate. You can then check against the transparency log and say, did the certificate authority publicly admit they issued this certificate? Or is it one that, a government made up or one that was made by somebody who hacked into the certificate authority? Now, it's still possible for an illegitimate certificate to be on the log because if you say hacked DigiNotar and got them to issue you a certificate, or if you remember, it was the Komodo one where if you had control of a subdomain, like a GitHub Pages, you could get a certificate for the root domain.
Yep.
But
that was one of my recent favorites. I mean, that's a good one.
So it doesn't stop everything, but it means that there's this clear log of exactly what happened, right? But it means that if nobody's publicly admitting they made this certificate, you definitely don't want to trust it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Right. We're not quite there yet because not every certificate authority publishes to the logs yet. And, we probably will eventually want logs other than just Google. And there's a couple, but, we have to develop a system for this so that, you don't have to go and check like 12 different logs that are run by different people to see if it's in any of them, or that certificate authorities have to publish to every log everybody decides to make, right? We have to it needs some fine tuning still, but one of the important things is it makes it possible to publicly audit the activities of a certificate authority. If all certificates are logged and only the ones that are logged are trusted, they can't scrub a certificate from the logs. They can't hide the fact that they incorrectly issued a certificate for Google or something. Right. Kind of it seemed like Symantec was trying to do that, and that's why Google's forcing them to use certificate transparency or face being untrusted. But it basically allows us to have more insight on what's actually happening at the certificate authorities or notice a pattern. It's like the logs show that this little known certificate authority in this tiny country like Luxembourg or something suddenly just issued certificates for like Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, and Apple. Like that seems out of the ordinary.
That's a little odd.
Yeah. And like we said, kind of related to that, it allows a website operator or someone who owns a domain or whatever to do automatic searches like with that crt.sh for their domain and see if there's any certificates that they didn't ask for. Right? Because it's an API, you could set this up that you would get an alert anytime a certificate is issued for your domain. And if that doesn't correspond with you specifically, getting a new certificate or renewing one, then, hey, red alarm lights going off. Right. We got to look into this.
Mm-hmm.
But before now, that wasn't really possible, right? Google would very much like to know whenever somebody tries to issue a certificate for Google, because they know that should only happen when they ask for one.
Yeah. Get a push notification, maybe a tweet.
Because CAs are prime targets, they have to and tend to take security very seriously. DigiNotar was actually not an exception to this. Among other things, it had segmented its computer networks into several different isolated partitions to constrain access attempts and used an intrusion prevention system to monitor all incoming and outgoing traffic. Every request for a new certificate had to be vetted and approved by 2 DigiNotar employees. Then, to issue the certificate, an employee had to insert a physical keycard into a computer kept in a heavily guarded room. According to the postmortem on DigiNotar, done by the security firm Fox IT, which was hired by the Dutch government to figure out what happened. This room could only be entered if authorized personnel used a biometric hand recognition device and entered the correct PIN code. This inner door was protected by an outer door connected by a set of doors that operated independent of each other, creating a sluice. These sluice doors had to be separately opened with an electronic door card that was operated using a separate system than the other doors. So that even if you hacked one of the door systems, that wouldn't get you through the second door or the first door, vice versa. To gain access to the outer door from the public accessible zone, another electronic door had to be opened with an electronic card. So you had to get into the outer room with a key card, and then you had to have a hand scan and then get through 2 completely separate key card systems and then go up to this computer and insert a physical key card to do all this stuff. So they had very good security setup for physical anyway.
Sounds pretty legit.
Mm-hmm. This mix of physical and virtual safeguards demonstrates that DigiNotar was not a company that had failed to think about or invest in security. It understood that the security was vital to its own reputation and for the wider world of internet users who relied upon, often even without knowing it, on DigiNotar certificates to tell them who to trust online. But DigiNotar also made some serious mistakes during the summer of 2011. For one, it was running some unpatched software on its web server, which allowed an intruder to begin burrowing into the maze of partition networks in June of 2011. On July 10th, the intruder successfully issued his first rogue certificate. So it seems like they could have spent as much of a month of actually tunneling through the system to actually be able to issue a certificate. All told, by the end of the summer, they would go on to issue 531 rogue certificates for domains ranging from AOL.com and Microsoft.com to Mossad.gov.il and CIA.gov. So once you've got access to a certificate authority server, issuing rogue certificates for high-value targets like the CIA is no harder than issuing them for sites like AOL. My one caveat to that is, in general, the SSL certificate for AOL is probably actually more valuable than the one for the CIA.
Yeah.
Because the CIA's general front page website doesn't really have anything on it. People aren't going to be submitting secret information there.
Yeah.
But people do log into their email accounts at AOL.
Top 10 stories by the CIA. That's what's at CIA.gov right now for 2016.
Yeah. So it's like you could figure out what people are searching
This
for.
is not a high
but
traffic website.
They don't have a login button anywhere, whereas AOL does.
Yeah.
So in this case, I'd actually say that the AOL one is a higher value target than the CIA, but for embarrassment factor, maybe the CIA is a bigger one.
Look at this, Alan. The CIA has a Kid Zone section on their website where you can learn more about the agency and find top secret things you won't see anywhere else. They have it for K through 5 and 6th through 12th grade. And there's a section here for parents and teachers, too.
Yeah, we have an interesting story in the roundup for 5-year-olds that are interested in security.
Well, there you go. Maybe then go to CIA.gov.
Yeah. So it's still unclear how exactly the intruders managed to bypass all the physical security in place to protect the inner sanctum where certificates are generated. But the investigators' best guess was that the key cards for a few of the computers were just left permanently in place. Because of the amount of hassle it involved going into that room to stick the key card in to issue a certificate, right? You had to hand scan and go through a bunch of these separate doors. Somebody would just leave the card in there, say during business hours or something, maybe they remove it at the end of the day, maybe not, but that might have weakened the security here. The other thing is, if the attacker was observing for a whole month or something, he might have been able to just piggyback on them doing a legitimate request, and while the key card is inserted, also do this other thing. Although, it's unclear. Although it's years later now, you think they might have been able to dig into it more, but we never got more detail on what happened there. If true, this would be largely defeated the purpose of requiring keycard insertion, not to mention all those sleuth stores, biometrics, and PIN codes in the first place. Again, all that great security defeated by pesky humans.
Yeah, and laziness.
Yep.
And you know what? It's always going to be that way, Alan.
Yep. So on July 19th, a routine check by DigiNotar revealed that some of the certificates it had ostensibly signed were not listed in the company's own logs. So obviously the attacker had found a way to issue certificates without them going in DigiNotar's logs, which is a problem. Right. This is something that the whole point of certificate transparency is that if it's not in the log, it's not trusted. And that means that any certificate issued this way in such a way that the certificate authority doesn't know about it means that the browsers won't trust it. But, there are a lot of systems outside of browsers. And the other thing is certificate transparency requires an internet connection to verify the certificate. There are a lot of times where that's not an option.
Very true. Especially on air-gapped machines, perhaps, that are highly valuable.
Other things, what happens if you want to launch an iPhone app on your phone while it's in airplane mode while you're on an airplane?
Or you just don't have connection. That happens to me all the time.
Yeah. Now, currently, it just authenticates the signature out of the trust store on the phone. It doesn't actually require an internet connection. Mm-hmm. But if we're going to have certificate transparency, sure. But if we just say, we'll just skip it if there's no internet connection, it's like, well, the attacker might be able to take advantage of that. And then what point is there to it anymore, right? But at the same time, Apple's not going to go having a pop-up like, you don't have an internet connection, so we're not sure if this app is legit. I don't see that being part of any
Not a
Apple
great user
UI.
experience, no.
Yeah. So indeed, DigiNotar had no record of ever issuing these certificates. They were promptly revoked, and DigiNotar launched an internal investigation to uncover even more rogue certificates. By the end of July, the company believed the problem had been dealt with. So it came as a shock when they got this report from a user in Iran in August that this was still happening. It surfaced that the Gmail help forum a month later, and Google in turn blamed an unauthorized Google.com certificate issued by DigiNotar. Some of the rogue certificates, it seems, had slipped through the cracks of DigiNotar's internal audit. The same thing was happening to Symantec recently. And they were being used to certify imposter websites. Thousands of Iranians who visited Google's website in August of 2011 were apparently redirected to a site that looked like Google websites and was also certified as belonging to Google by these rogue certificates, but wasn't. Google's numbers from stats in the Chrome browser indicate that just shy of 300,000 unique IP addresses trying to access Google websites were affected, and 95% of those IPs originated in Iran. I'm guessing most of the other ones might have been Iranian users using a VPN but leaking their DNS through their not VPN connection or something, where they were hitting the same thing. So they say, why bother redirecting hundreds of thousands of Iranian Google users to fraudulent websites? Probably in order to read their email.
That's what I was thinking.
Or just know what they're searching for and all those other things. Only one thing stood in the way of that, though, Google Chrome. So Google had taken to hard coding the hashes of certificates for Google-owned websites into the Chrome browser. So that, rather than trusting the whole root store, they're like, this is the certificate that is Google, and any other certificate claiming to be Google is fake. And it detects this type of situation where this fake certificate was being used. Where a supposedly trusted certificate is in fact not authorized by Google. So it was actually just that certificate pinning that Google was doing in Chrome that saved a lot of those users from having their searches and email intercepted.
And now that's sort of standard practice, right?
Yes and no. So there are certificate pinning systems that Google and Chrome use, or Firefox and Chrome use, and there's also the same for there's Edge. The HSTS, the HTTP security or strict transport security, where basically would be if this website, this website will always have SSL, but that only works if you've been to the website before to have gotten that message. So the browsers have a way of saying, hey, these specific websites will always have HTTPS, and basically preceding that record. But to get on the browser certificate pinning list, you have to be a major website like Facebook or something. And so that doesn't really apply to, say, the Jupiter Broadcasting website. Not that there's anything that's secure there, but, some government might be interested in who's watching Unfilter. So, yeah, the effort to do certificate pinning has been expanded, and other browsers implement similar systems. But there's also systems to allow individual websites to publish the hashes of their trusted certificates. So one of them is called TLSA, which basically is you publish the fingerprint of your certificate that's the right one via DNS. And then the browser can check and be like, okay, that certificate matches, and therefore we can trust that this website that certificate is the real one. And if we trust that certificate, we know that it's the real website. But that requires DNSSEC, because otherwise a man in the middle could change the DNS response to be the hash of their certificate. And there's a couple other systems for it, but none of them work all that great yet. But someday we'll have something for this. And what's interesting is that if we actually if DNSSEC was a thing everywhere and we could just use TLSA, then we wouldn't even need certificate authorities. I could sign my own certificate, and by publishing it via DNS, I could say, yeah, that's the trusted certificate for this website, and your browser could trust it without having to talk to a CA at all. Maybe that's why there's a little pushback against doing this type of thing. But, I think the push to do it has been slightly stymied by Let's Encrypt, which makes it easy and free to have a regular certificate. But we'll get to them in a second. Anyway, so no one has ever been caught or charged with the compromise of DigiNotar, though many have speculated that Iran's government was likely involved because that's where the certificates were used, and they were one of the only people in a position to be able to man in the middle of the users. The only clue left by the intruder, a message left behind on a DigiNotar server, offers only insight into the perpetrator's mission or identity, or little insight into mission or identity, other than a profound sense of self-importance. He says, I know you are shocked of my skills, but I got access to your network. There is no any hardware or software in the world exists which could stop my heavy attacks, my brain or my skill or my will or my experience.
That's pretty good. It's poetic almost.
Yes, and it's hard to argue with his point when he compromised the certificate authority that had all these security systems and started to choose certificates for Google. There's being cocky, and then there's being right, right?
Yeah. I know you are shocked of my skills.
The discovery of the DigiNotar compromise left the browser and CA community, to say nothing of the Dutch government, reeling. Browser vendors rushed to revoke trust in the DigiNotar certificates, but removing a root CA was not entirely straightforward. The Firefox, people said, we actually needed to push out an update to Firefox because the CA information was hard-coded into the browser. There wasn't a system in place to be able to do this quickly. They had to actually offer the next version of Firefox and have people update in order to be safe. Additionally, many legitimate websites, including those operated by the Dutch government, were relying on DigiNotar certificates. So if they just stopped trusting DigiNotar altogether, you would get certificate warnings when you went to the Dutch government website to say, file your taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Not a great
Doesn't
user
inspire
experience.
confidence. Not so much.
So the browser vendors were forced to hold off a blanket ban on DigiNotar. Instead, they decided to block all DigiNotar certificates issued after July 1st of 2011. So anything that happened after the point where they were compromised. So anything before that would still be trusted, and anything after would be gone. And that way you're only impacting websites that got certificates within the 2 months of what happened. And then allowing users to decide whether they wanted to trust the older certificates. But giving users that autonomy over the online security only works if they have to understand what the messages are, right? If you go to the government website and get this weird message, do you click yes or do you click no? And if you click yes, go anyway, at what point are you going to do that when the message is that certificate is totally fake, right? That's why if you've ever had to accept a non-valid certificate in Firefox, it requires like 4 clicks, because the idea is that you really don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So while browsers scrambled to protect their users, the Dutch government took charge of DigiNotar and commissioned the Fox IT company to investigate what had gone wrong. Mm-hmm. Hans Hugerstraten, who led the investigation, said in an email, "What really shocked me was when I realized the impact it had on the people of Iran. In those days, people got killed for having a different opinion. The hackers, which were presumably the state, had access to over 300,000 Gmail accounts. The realization of that, the security of a small company in Holland may have played a part in the killing or torture of people really shocked me."
Like the real world ramifications of this.
Yes, it's like this isn't just PGP keys and open source rah rah stuff, right?
It also suggests that they did it with an intent to find some specific people, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So perhaps the most significant change in the certificate landscape is simply that there are now many more certificates than there were 5 years ago. For a couple of reasons, right? We've seen after 2013 and the Snowden leaks, suddenly more people wanted things encrypted. Mm-hmm. Google changed their search algorithm to give more points to the websites that offer HTTPS.
Right.
You have the EFF's HTTPS everywhere. All these things have meant more people wanting certificates. And, part of the giant increase in the number of certificates is Let's Encrypt.
Sure.
Which was launched earlier in 2016, provides free certificates to anyone who wants them. Let's Encrypt doesn't provide the extended validation certificates because that involves a manual verification of the owner's identity. That's the kind the most high-value targets generally get and warrant a green box. But, none of my banks use the green ones.
Can't
Actually,
recall.
one of them does. Never mind. But that process can't be automated, so Let's Encrypt doesn't do that. But there are hundreds of millions of websites and devices out there, and in the future, there'll be billions. For every one of those to have a certificate, we'll need an issuance system that can be fully automated. Says Josh Asa, who's the founder of the Internet Security Research Group, which helped establish Let's Encrypt. They say issuing more certificates helps spread encryption, but it also raises the stakes of the security of the certificate authorities and the risk posed by incidents like DigiNotar. Because it means that an increasing amount of online community relies on the protection provided by these digital certificates. And so that got me thinking about it a little bit. And I know Let's Encrypt has a couple of things in place. They're basically an intermediate from a regular CA, but they have a backup one from a different CA in case something happens there. Mm-hmm. So that all the Let's Encrypt certificates will just suddenly go away one day or something.
Yeah.
But I wonder if they actually maybe need to be a root CA and be able to issue their own intermediate CAs and have a separate intermediate for each day, each calendar day, right? So that if something were to happen, like say DigiNotar, they could revoke the certificates for a specific date range without, just rather than having to revoke each individual certificate, they could just revoke the intermediate CA that signed the certificate for each of those different, for that date range, for each of the days in that date range, without impacting all certificates. I'm sure there's some technical limitations to that, and obviously it gets pretty messy with the root store if you have to have all these things. But it seems like Let's Encrypt in particular needs to, consider a way in order to have most of these certificates be not such of a problem. Although the advantage that Let's Encrypt has is that because certificates are only valid for 90 days, they can very quickly roll over everything. And everybody who's using Let's Encrypt, well, not everybody, almost everybody using Let's Encrypt has this all automated. So if they needed to just get reissued a new certificate that was signed by a different root CA or whatever, it's just a matter of that cron tab or whatever that runs. So actually, maybe Let's Encrypt is in a better position than most other places to be able to do this. But, in certain places, the Let's Encrypt certificates are a little hard to use. Like, say you wanted to protect the BMC, the IPMI system on a server, where you have to get the whole certificate and then upload it via the web interface for the management system. You can't really automate that with Let's Encrypt, right? And there's no, .well-known directory in there where that the BMC can publish the certificate to, or the I forget what they call the little file you use with Let's Encrypt to prove that you own the domain or whatever.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
So Let's Encrypt doesn't work for everything yet, but it's getting there.
Yeah, Anyway,
the problems with CA...
just before you move on, if you think about it now at the position of 2017, it was kind of one of the biggest things to happen to the internet for 2016. Especially for people that before would just never bother, and now they just had immediate access to it. Looking back at it, it was a really big deal. It was. Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Just kind of in awe at the beginning of 2017 of that.
Yeah. So Berta Nuda in the chat room points out that Let's Encrypt requires a public website somewhere. That's not actually completely true. Almost all of the clients require that, but there is a system with Let's Encrypt to prove you own a domain with a DNS record, and so it is somewhat possible to be able to create certificates that are only for use internally, where the thing where the certificate is going to be installed isn't necessarily open to the public. But yes, Let's Encrypt doesn't do wildcard certificates because it's a lot harder to prove that that's safe sometimes. But wildcard certificates is how I've solved a lot of problems myself. So it'd be great if they had them. But I know the FreeBSD project moved away from a wildcard certificate from a regular CA to issuing individual certificates for each different subdomain using Let's Encrypt. It took a little while to do the initial transition because you can only issue like 20 certificates a week with Let's Encrypt. But once they're issued, the renewals aren't really limited, so it was easy enough. Anyway, so the problems with certificate authorities have not gone away. In March of 2015, years after the collapse of DigiNotar, Google discovered another set of rogue certificates for Google domains. These certificates were issued by an Egyptian company, MCS Holdings, which in turn received its certificates from CNNIC, which is a certificate authority operated by the Chinese Internet Network Information Center, which is an agency of the Chinese government's Ministry of Information and Industry. But soon after, Firefox and Chrome both removed CNNIC from their root CA lists, although why were they there in the first place, right? Just this summer, the Chinese CA WoSign, which had bought and started SSL, was accused of issuing fake certificates for GitHub and Alibaba. And in October, Mozilla announced that it would no longer trust WoSign certificates. But thanks in no small part to the legacy of DigiNotar, browsers and CAs alike are better able to deal with problems like this than they were 5 years ago. Hopefully every CA has a plan for what if we get DigiNotar'd, whereas in 2011 they didn't.
Yeah.
Right. And the browsers have built systems so they can more quickly revoke stuff, not have to issue a full software update that can take a week to get tested and published and get people to actually install. CAs can now revoke compromised certificates faster, check certificates against public logs, and restrict the use of rogue certificates with pinning. But in other, more fundamental ways, the system of relying on CAs to tell us who we can and can't trust online remains inherently vulnerable, and perhaps, more importantly, largely invisible to most internet users.
Yes.
So, while maybe most of the people watching the show understand how it works, most other people don't. And so when they get the certificate warnings or, was Google's going to start saying this website's not secure for all non-HTTPS websites, general users don't really understand what that means.
Right.
And even if Google provides some help text for that to explain it to them, it's really not the same thing.
Yeah.
The complexity of the certificate infrastructure can make it difficult for the wider public, beyond the community of browsers and certificate authorities who have long been attuned to the importance of the DigiNotar compromise, to understand the risks they face online, as well as the signals and warnings that their browsers are providing. I think we've covered a paper a while ago about that a university student did on the kind of redesigning the UI of the certificate warnings to actually and malware warnings to make the user actually understand it and not just be a big scary click no, or keep going anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
It's like, well, at the same time, I want, for the benefit of regular users, Firefox to be really anal about all these things, but in a couple of cases, there are some certificates that are so bad it won't let you continue anyway. Like even with 6 button clicks, even going into about config.
Doesn't matter how many. Yeah.
Not possible to go to this website. It's like, but I need to. And I resorted to having like a portable version of Firefox, like 17, that didn't have this check.
Wow.
Or using a proxy, basically. So my browser is actually seeing a connection from a certificate I trusted from an Nginx somewhere, and then it's making the connection to the really bad web server.
And Nginx don't care.
Just to let me to get the connection, because it's the management system for this server I'm renting, and I can't update. The company doesn't make newer firmware, or I can't update that firmware, but I need to access the system.
I'm trying to picture the moment where Alan Jude is sitting at his desk and he realizes, shit, I've got to set up a proxy server.
I literally cannot connect to this because the key size is too small.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't IPMI. It was an old KVM, and it was doing like a 512-bit certificate, which is just terrible. It was inexcusable when the device was new,
right?
But the device was new in like 2007. And they
older than the show.
Firmware for it a long time ago.
Yeah. Yep, been
but
there.
It's for my old servers that don't have IPMI.
Right. Well, now you've got that proxy server whenever you need to do that.
Yeah. So the folks who operate the CAs are really a very tempting point of attack, says Daniel Gilmore, who's a senior staff technologist for the American Civil Liberties Union, on the Privacy and Technology Project. If you wanted to attack someone else, I would be looking for a lever of control they might not even know existed, like some of the underlying things for the certificate authorities and things like Heartbleed and all this other stuff. The more we gloss over the critical components of the trust infrastructure that underlie our online communications, an infrastructure that is every bit as relevant today as it was 5 years ago, the harder it becomes to grasp how deeply and fundamentally all of our security is predicated on the security of those digital certificates and the companies that issue them.
Mm-hmm.
While much has changed, a lot of these issues aren't solved yet. Things have gotten a lot better since 2011, but a lot of the same problems still exist. And, as we've seen with Symantec and WoSign and all this other stuff, there's no sign of things actually getting that much better. We're getting more systems in place, but part of it is the way the internet works is we still have to support the people that have old hardware or old software to a point. Anyway, we've done a fairly good job of just being like, all right, certificate's that old, there's nothing we can do. Right. But, we need to decide how we're going to solve this problem because it takes 5+ years for that solution to actually become mainstream.
It hurts.
And
That
it's like,
hurts.
you really got to think, how do we want to be doing this in 2025?
Yeah.
And we have to plan for that because it takes a couple of years to come up with a standard and then 5+ years to get it to actually be used everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And not even everywhere, just at a high enough level
Just
where we
a
can...
high enough place that we can turn off the old one and say, screw those people that haven't updated yet.
Yeah, that's what's crazy. Wow, that's a huge story. I think that might have been a 50-minute story almost. I'm not sure how far in we are. We're probably not quite, but wow. Any other thoughts on that story, Alan?
I think I've said enough.
All right, well then let's take a moment and say a few things about IX Systems. In fact, maybe you could visit ixsystems.com/TechSNAP to help support TechSNAP, celebrate episode 300, and learn more about IX Systems and their incredible rigs built around those Intel processors. ixsystems.com/TechSNAP's where you go to land and then dig around that site. Check it out. Everything from the FreeNAS Mini, the servers they build for your workload, TrueNAS, and the TrueRack. And they have a post up that I think might be kind of illuminating for some of you on their blog. Become a RAID hero. And I don't have much experience with TrueNAS, but this sounds like it's a kind of an interesting introduction to some of the features.
This is just comparing hardware RAID to software RAID mostly.
Well, and the TrueNAS software RAID, right? Yeah, which is pretty compelling stuff in here. I like this.
Well, for a long time, software RAID was the red-haired stepchild that nobody wanted to use. Hardware RAID was always better.
Yes, right.
But nowadays, hardware RAID is something on a card with a firmware made how many years ago that is a complete black box. And the software RAID is ZFS, which is open source and gets used and can be updated if something goes wrong. Which one do you want to use?
That's right. Yeah.
The hardware RAID is powered by a little 100 megahertz ARM chip on the card, and ZFS is powered by the 32 core 4 gigahertz Xeon you have.
Yeah. Very true.
Which one do you think is going to do a good job?
Very true. The great thing about IX Systems is it's going to be a sales process like you've never experienced before. I don't know what it is about all the other companies out there, but they made me a it's not a jarred lover. What's it called, Alan, when you've been burned? What's that called? You're
scorned.
Scorned. I was a bit of a scorned lover when it came to the whole sales process of buying hardware when I got to IX. I would admit that. I came in with a little preconceptions about how sales should go and how I should just submit everything through a form and then they should just whip me out a machine. In fact, I remember thinking it was going to be a complete waste of my time, and then by the time I finished the process, I was so grateful that I had done it. It is just the beginning of a great experience when you go to IX. ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. Go there to support the show, learn more about those crazy systems running those great Intel processors, and much more. ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. Alan, do you think we could really do episode 300 without doing a Schneier story? I mean, come on, Bruce Schneier's got it. We got to do a Bruce Schneier story, right?
Yeah, well, this one I thought was a good one to cover because it kind of explains, I think we've maybe talked about class breaks before and how that could, if somebody did a class break against RSA, that might throw the entire certificate thrust system out the window.
Dun, dun, dun.
But this one's a little bit more aimed at IoT and just thinking about the way we're changing a lot of things in the way we use computers for everything.
Interesting.
And thinking about how we have to look at security a lot differently than we have before.
All right. You got my attention.
And it breaks it down to things people understand, like stealing cars.
Now you definitely got my attention.
Yeah. So there's a concept from computer security known as a class break. It's a particular security vulnerability that breaks not just the one system you're attacking, but an entire class of systems. Examples might be a vulnerability in a particular operating system that allows you to compromise any computer using that operating system. Or a vulnerability in an internet-enabled digital video recorder or webcam that allows an attacker to recruit all of these devices into a massive botnet. When has that ever happened? Can you think of an instance where that's ever happened? So in a particular way, computer systems can... It's a peculiar way in which computer systems can fail, exacerbated by the characteristics of computers and software. It only takes one smart person to figure out how to attack the system. Once he does that, he can write software that automates his attack. He can then do the attack over the internet, so he doesn't have to be near the victim. He can automate the attack, so he can do it while he sleeps. He can then pass that ability onto someone else or to lots of people who don't have any skill, hence script kiddies. This changes the nature of security failures and completely upends how we need to defend against them, right? So for example, picking a mechanical lock. This is a skill that's gotten quite a bit of hype lately as more and more people are learning lock picking, right?
Yeah.
That requires both skill and time to do. Each lock is a new job, and success with one lock doesn't guarantee success with this another lock of the same design. Electronic door locks, on the other hand, like the ones you find in, say, hotel rooms, have different vulnerabilities. An attacker can find a flaw in the design that allows him to create a key card that opens every door. If he publishes this attack software, not just the attacker, but anyone who could download it can now unlock every door. And if these locks are, say, connected to the internet, an attacker could potentially open every door lock everywhere remotely.
Yeah.
At the same time. Just imagine just every door lock in like entire chains of hotels just unlocking at the same time. That's a class break. So that's how computer systems fails. But it's not how we think about failures. We think about, automobile security in terms of individual car thieves manually stealing individual cars, right? And so our defenses against that are based on that. Like, I'm going to put my car in a locked garage, and that's going to help a bit. That's an extra layer they would have to get through. And so they're going to go after this easier car over there, and all those types of things, right? But we don't think about hackers remotely taking control of cars via, say, the OnStar system, or other featured cars that we've talked about, or say remotely disabling every car over the internet. Right? That we don't think about that when we think about car security. We think about someone trying to take the car. But what if they just made every car not start tomorrow? That's as good as stealing the car as far as you're not being able to use the car. They just don't necessarily get to sell the car like they would normally do with maybe stealing a car. Or we think about voting fraud as, individual unauthorized people being able to vote or voting twice or whatever. We don't think about a single person or organization remotely manipulating thousands of internet-connected voting machines. So in a sense, class breaks are not a new concept in risk management. It's the difference between, say, home burglaries and fires, which happen occasionally to different houses in a neighborhood over the course of a year, versus, say, floods and earthquakes, which basically happen to everyone in a neighborhood or no one. Right? If there's a flood, it's going to take out everybody on the street. Whereas if there's fire, it's probably only going to happen to one house or a burglary or something.
Yeah.
And so if you're in the insurance company, you treat those two things differently. But you're the insurance company. You have to cover both things. Insurance companies can handle both types of risk, but they're very different. The increased computerization of everything that's is moving from being the burglary/fire risk model to the new flood earthquake model, because they're not going to pick the lock to your front door. They're going to find a flaw in the app you use on your phone to unlock your door and unlock every door in your neighborhood, right? And so it goes from being a fire at your house to a flood taking out your neighborhood. Which is a given threat either affects a town or it doesn't affect anyone at all. So it makes a big difference in the way we think about the security of everything.
I like that.
And it's not even necessarily just security, but just reliability, right? It's like if your thermostat breaks down, your house is cold or hot, but your neighbor's is fine. But if somebody finds a way to hack every nest, then a whole lot of people's houses are too cold at the wrong time, right?
Yeah.
There's a key difference between floods and earthquakes and a class break in computer systems, though. A flood and earthquakes are random natural phenomenon, while the latter is human-directed. Floods don't change their behavior to maximize the damage based on the types of defenses we build, right? If we build drainage systems and ways to redirect the river when it overflows, the river doesn't try harder to take out your house. It's just like, okay, you won. Whereas an attacker is going to design his attack to go around the defenses you built. Right?
That makes sense.
Attackers do that to computer systems. Attackers examine your systems looking for class breaks. And once they find them, they'll exploit it again and again and again until the vulnerability is fixed. And even then, they'll then just look for a way to go around the vulnerability and continue attacking. Right? We saw this with the PHP mailer exploit. Just before Christmas, they found this exploit and it got fixed.
Right.
And then 2 days later, they were like, actually, we found a way around your fix so that we can still exploit this vulnerability. It's like, because, it's like, oh, the river looks like it might flood this year. We set up some sandbags. And it's like, well, the river's like, well, I'm going to go higher than your sandbags. And it's like, well, shit. Luckily, rivers aren't, out to get you that hard.
Yeah, thankfully. Although sometimes you wonder. No, mostly I'm just worried about bears.
Yeah. And the bears can learn a little bit, but
yeah. What about raccoons, Alan? Let's be honest. Yeah. Raccoons, those are clever.
Yeah. So as we move into the world of the Internet of Things and connected everything, where computers permeate our lives at every level, class breaks will become increasingly important. The combination of automation and action at a distance will give attackers more power and leverage than they've ever had before, right? Like we've seen this with ransomware for TVs. It's like, we found this vulnerability. We could take out every TV of this brand. And, what are they going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Security notions like the precautionary principle, where the potential harm is so great that we err on the side of not deploying new technology without proof of security, will become more important in a world where an attacker can open up all the door locks or hack all the power plants. It's not an inherently less secure world, but it's a differently secure world. It's a world where driverless cars are much safer than people-driven cars until suddenly they're not. Right. So we're moving towards these
one day we wake
cars,
up and there's some vulnerability.
Yeah, and they're much better, fewer accidents, everything will be better.
Right.
And then suddenly someone will figure out how to make your car drive off a cliff with you in it.
And then they're not.
And then suddenly everybody wants to go back to driving their own car.
Yeah. Huh.
But, even if you're driving your own car, a lot of cars now have the ability to apply the brakes even when you didn't.
Yeah. As part of the cruise control, or also tug
just
on the
emergency braking,
tug on the belt, and a little bit of lane correction too if you're drifting. They'll also assist, lane assist. Yes.
So because of this, we need to build systems that assume the possibility of class breaks and maintain security despite them.
I agree.
Sadly, we don't have a magic way to just do that tomorrow, but
snap our fingers, Alan. It'd be our gift as of well, we are trying. Just takes us a little while to get there. That was a great write-up. Bruce has got a good way of phrasing things to make you think about it. That really help you connect, and I'm glad you covered that one. Any other thoughts on that story, Mr. Jude?
Nope.
All right. Now we are moving, and I will mention DigitalOcean, our next sponsor on the TechSNAP program. Go over to DigitalOcean and use our promo code SNAPOcean. That's one word. You apply it to your account after you create one, and you get a $10 credit. And then you are cooking with gas, my friends. Check this out. DigitalOcean is simple cloud hosting that's super fast to spin up, really easy to use, SSDs for all of their disks, and they offer hourly pricing. You can get some amazing rigs for just like 3 cents an hour, 6 cents an hour, all just unbelievably reasonable. Or if you want to pay monthly, check out the $5 rig, $10 rig, and $20 rig. That's generally my range, depending on the work. And they also offer like super high-end memory and block storage where you can attach up to 16 terabytes to your system. If you're not a server expert, it doesn't really matter. They have entire images ready to go. You can deploy, then you maintain it yourself. Or if you are someone who knows what the heck you're doing, you're going to love the fact that you can start with the base OS of basically any modern distribution or FreeBSD, get going, and then just use their documentation and their API to take advantage of all the more advanced features. And now they have valuable... Go ahead.
Because they have the HTML5 console, you don't even have to start there. We had a tutorial on BSD Now a couple weeks ago about starting with the FreeBSD they give you, but erasing it and doing your own completely fresh installs so you control all the partitioning the way you want or whatever. And we've had other tutorials in the past on how to install operating systems they don't offer. Using the HTML5 console, you can write the installer image for whatever OS you want to use into, say, the swap, and then trick it into booting off of that, and then overwrite the virtual disk with whatever operating system you want. So if they don't have the one you want, you can still do it. If you go over to BSD Now, we have tutorials on installing like NetBSD and OpenBSD. But those could easily be adapted to installing, whatever your favorite Linux is that they don't offer.
I also would mention, too, they have great documentation. They have an introduction to configuration management, which is a 4-part series. They have guides up on installing Linux, Nginx, MySQL, PHP on Debian, Ruby as well, a bunch of other stuff. Check it out. They got a whole bunch of good tutorials that help you get even more out of your DigitalOcean service. DigitalOcean.com. Big thank you to DigitalOcean, and thanks to everybody for using our promo code SNAPOcean. Also, check out the new DigitalOcean monitoring coming soon, where you can collect metrics on your Droplets performance and get alerts and all kinds of stuff. DigitalOcean.com. Use the promo code SNAPOcean. One word, apply it to your account. And a big thank you to DigitalOcean for sponsoring TechSNAP. Okay, so hiding malware in a PNG. Mm-hmm. Tell me about this. Sounds dangerous.
So if you remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked about that the DNS changer exploit kit that was hiding the payload in a regular image file on the advertising network.
Yep.
So a researcher has shown us how to actually do that yourself with a PNG image, so that you can upload your malware to Imager and get free hosting. With the recent router hijack malware, we saw the attackers were hiding the encrypted payload in an image file served by the advertising network, and then the JavaScript would decrypt it and extract the payload only if the victim met a certain set of criteria, so that it wouldn't show up during the advertising network's malware scans. Right?
I'm sure they're constantly looking.
Yeah. Well, some of them actually at least try to prevent malicious ads.
Well, yeah, it's...
But the main advantage to this method is it doesn't leave a trail back to a command and control infrastructure. Whereas most other ones where it's going to, you get the downloader and then it goes out to a website somewhere and downloads the malware, that's one of those signatures that any virus software can eventually block. But if the payload is delivered via the advertising network, then you can't just block that necessarily, right? There's no central location or obvious sign that the computer was downloading some malware. So your intrusion prevention system doesn't see this connection to some weird website you wouldn't expect. All you're seeing is the legitimate connection to download an image from the Google advertising network, or whatever other advertising network it happens to be. But it means that there's no separate connection going out and downloading the malware. It's just kind of bundled in this expected traffic. So this post shows a crude method of hiding an executable file in a PNG image and posting it to Imager. Because with Imager, you don't have to sign up or anything.
Right.
You can just post. So there's no trail back to you this way.
That's pretty clever.
The image can then be downloaded by a PowerShell script or Visual Basic script or Microsoft Office macro or whatever. So PNG files are different than most other image formats. Not 4 words. Sorry. Fixing show notes here.
Live show note corrections by Alan Jude.
So like with a JPEG, you have an original image and then you compress it by taking out bits that your eye doesn't really notice. And so the resulting file at the very end isn't the same as the original, right? Because JPEG is lossy. Some of the data goes away. PNG is lossless. It's basically a bitmap that is then just zlib compressed. So it's basically a gzipped bitmap. And so that means when you ungzip it, you get back exactly the perfect image. So it makes it a lot easier to hide information in it because you know that none of the bits are actually going to get thrown away.
Right, okay.
So each pixel in a regular 24-bit like high-resolution PNG, each pixel on the screen is represented by 4 1-byte values. Basically the values between 0 and 255 for red, green, blue, and the alpha channel, which is the transparency.
Okay.
So, if the values were like, 0, 0, 255, 128, then that would be a blue pixel that was half see-through.
Okay.
So this allows the image to represent the full spectrum of colors, right? Because you have 256 possible values for red, green, and blue. So 256 times 256 times 256 is 2 to the power of 24, which is 16.7 million different colors that you can make. That's pretty much standard. Yeah. And then each of those pixels that can be one of those 16.7 million colors can be 256 different degrees of see-through. from not see-through at all to completely see-through. So in the post example, the JPEG, they have a JPEG image. If you scroll down a little bit, it's actually a JPEG of like antivirus software. So there's this little virus-free guarantee.
Yeah.
So he takes that JPEG and encodes it into the image we saw at the beginning of the dice. And then the resulting image, you can see, has like static in it, like an old-fashioned analog TV.
Is that down here?
Scroll up.
Oh, okay. Of the dice. I got so delighted by that. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, so like if you look at scroll up a little bit more, look at the original dice. You can see there's just
nice
some nice
clean.
digital like translucent dice on a black background. But in the version with the crudely hidden image in it, is just static, because all we're doing is base 64 encoded that JPEG, and used the transparency value of each pixel to represent 1 byte of the original file. And so it's made the image kind of washed out because it's half transparent, and it's very statically because you have all these random values. Now, if you use a slightly better algorithm for it, you could make it much smoother. And if you had a big enough PNG and a small enough payload, you could actually only use a small amount of variance, like only make it just a tiny, tiny bit transparent, such that people wouldn't notice.
Sure.
And so if you had a carefully chosen image as your original, you could have the version with the embedded image or the embedded file like undetectably the same. Like you would need to use like image diff or the SHA checksum to tell that they were not the same image. If more work were put into it, it'd be much harder to detect. And so then he's got the Python script at the top that actually encodes his fake image in, and then he shows taking it out and verifying with the SHA-512 that the hashes are the same.
Now, how are you? You're hiding the malware, but how are you getting anything to execute it?
Well, so in this case, it's not about. There have been bugs before where PNGs could be tricked into executing things, but it's not that. In this case, it's just you've already compromised the computer or whatever, but you want to download the malware from somewhere that's not going to be blocked. Or that's not going to stand out as, that's obviously them downloading malware.
Right.
Whereas if you're pulling an image from, say, Google, or you're pulling an image from an advertising network or from Imager, that's not going to look like you're downloading a virus executable. It looks like you're downloading an image of some dice. Right? So it makes it harder for intrusion detection systems to tell that this computer is downloading a virus. So in this case, you would have to still get them to run the PowerShell script or the VB script or the Microsoft Office macro. And it talks a bit more about that. But there's, if you at the very bottom, you can see the example where they hit a version of calculator.exe in an image, and then when you ran the PowerShell script, it downloads the image in PowerShell, extracts the data out of it, figures out, the alpha channel stuff, pulls out calc.exe and runs it, and there you go. You've now downloaded a virus and run it on the computer, and the only internet connection you made out was to download an image from a website that looks innocent.
Which, probably came in over HTTP, no big deal. Looks like standard technology, standard traffic, I mean.
Someone in the chat room says that they just tried it and they got an error. Make sure that the image you're embedding has to be smaller than the PNG. In particular, because you're only using the alpha channel, obviously you could mess with the other colors too, but then the original image is going to get awfully distorted. Because you're only using the alpha channel, your image that you're embedding needs to be no more than 1/4 the number of bytes that of the original PNG. Although not quite because of compression. So one of the other cool things about this one versus some other steganography is that the resulting file isn't necessarily going to be any bigger than the one without anything encoded.
Right.
If you have a regular image that's not transparent, all that alpha channel is just zeros. So it compresses well. So your new file might actually be slightly bigger because it won't compress as well with the data in there. But in general, it's not actually going to be bigger. There's some other ways he's talked about it doing this is Imager, because it processes the images, strips some stuff off. But there was other ways you could do it where you could have just a regular JPEG, and a JPEG viewer will read it and then stop at the end of the JPEG. But if you had other data there, it was still there. So you could just take a JPEG and then cat a zip file onto the end of it and then upload that image. Although Imager, because they process the image and you lower the quality for JPEGs or whatever, it eats the zip file. But this technique of hiding it in the alpha channel means that it doesn't get taken away.
Mm-hmm.
And he reported it to Imager, and they've decided that right now it's not going to exploit people visiting Imager or anything, so they're not that worried about it. But at some point it might be, hey, this image doesn't have any transparency, so I'm just going to overwrite all the alpha channel with zeros and get rid of the hidden message.
Yeah.
Although there are some other ways to hide the message, and you could always make the image partly transparent so that they wouldn't do that. But it's just an interesting technique, and just showing us how you could do like that the browser malware did, where the malware is actually mostly JavaScript and then going to take advantage of some exploit in like Flash or something.
Right.
But it's hiding the payload in the image because you see, oh, that's just an image. I'm not going to look at that part. And I see the JavaScript. No, it doesn't seem to do anything that bad.
It's hiding the malware in plain sight, Alan.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, you see what I did there? Huh. Fascinating. Well, thanks for finding that for us and sharing it. And it does remind us of the story that we covered recently. Okay, you ready to move on?
Shows you how you could do that.
Yeah, and the whole trick of the fact that because of the way you're doing it doesn't make the image a whole bunch larger is particularly tricky.
Yeah, some of the other ones were like, oh, we just hide it in the comments in the JPEG, or hide it in the data that's going to get ignored. It's like, well, that mostly works, but
you'll see the size.
That stuff might go away.
Yes.
Whereas, unless they resize the image on the PNG, it's unlikely that any processing is actually going to nuke this stuff. Whereas like metadata about when the PNG was created, often on sites like Imager, they purposely erase that so that the image doesn't propagate, say, the latitude and longitude of where you made the image or something. So a lot of that metadata where you might otherwise hide information gets removed or overwritten on purpose, or just by the image processing tools they use. It now says instead of created by the software you use, is created by the software they use. But because you're hiding this in the transparency, it's part of the image and the software doesn't end up touching it.
And there it is. All right, you want to know about something else that's just a little tricky? How about Ting? Ting's on a mission to make mobile make sense. TechSNAP.ting.com is where you go. You get $25 in service credit if you bring a device. Or if you want, you can get $25 off a brand new device from Ting. TechSNAP.ting.com. Minutes, messages, and megabytes. That's all you pay for at Ting. It's $6 for each line. You can have one line or you can have a dozen lines, or probably more. In fact, if you're a small business and you have about 10 lines, you're almost guaranteed you're going to save money with Ting. TechSNAP.ting.com. Go there. Average bill is about $23 a month. They have fanatically good customer service. You'll talk to a real human. They'll stick with you through problems. They have CDMA and GSM networks to choose from. They have a great dashboard to manage every aspect. Oh, hello, drop-down terminal. To manage every aspect of your account. I was just looking, you think about it, $9 for a SIM card, there's all kinds of uses for that, from security systems to IoT devices, quote unquote, and flash update, also phones. Who knew, right? Phones. You could put them in phones and tablets, actually. That's kind of legit. TechSNAP, that's super nice, because think about this. With Ting, like myself, I have a tablet that I use that I pretty much always have on Wi-Fi. Every now and then, I'd love to have mobile service with it. It's a great candidate for a Ting SIM. So we did it. And it's so simple too, because when you're done, you just cancel it, you turn it off. It's not a big deal. There's no contract. There's no termination fee. It's very simple. It really is the way mobile should work. Start by going to techsnap.ting.com. Also, while you're there, even if you're not a Ting customer, it might be worth checking out their blog. Lots of good stuff these days on cord cutting, and a post that sort of rounds up why 2017 is going to be a pretty good year for cord cutters. You can check it out, but just do us a favor and visit techsnap.ting first, and then click on over to the blog, techsnap.ting.com. Thanks to Ting for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. So BSD Now 175, right? Is that right? 175? Yeah, got out nice and early this morning. And the title, How the D-Trace Saved Christmas. Nice, guys.
I got a tweet from the author originally. It's like, they did a good breakdown of my post and came up with a much better title than I did.
That's very funny. That's very good. Looks like a pretty good episode.
Just because you don't have the source code to software doesn't mean you can't fix it.
Yeah. That D-Trace is such an amazing tool, Alan. That is really good. Oh, and the save my blog's name guy got in there. Good. That was a great blog post. I'm glad you guys covered that. Yep. That looks like a great episode. So check it out, BSD Now. And, even though Alan and I are stepping aside, of course, I'm still on all the other shows I do, and Alan will still be on BSD Now. And so if you want more Jude in your face, you can go get it right now. Go grab episode 175. Why not get the HD version? Because this is about the halfway point of this show, which means by the time this show's over, you'd have more high-definition Jude ready to go. Go check it out. BSD Now.
Yeah, I'll still be here every week.
That's right.
Well, it's just not here. I'll be there.
You're over there. You'll be
able to see me every week still. So
just go to the same website. You just click on a different show, basically. All right. With the news all done, it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com or popping that contact link at the top of the Jupiter Broadcasting website. Or maybe you started a thread in our subreddit at techsnap.reddit.com. Platypus Moo writes in with our first one about ZFS on Linux. And he says, have a happy new beer. And he would like to mention that he's building a new Linux home server, and he'd like to add an L2 ARC and a ZIL once he's paid off all the other components. He's got a Xeon in there. Wow. Damn. He's got himself a nice rig. But he says, here are my questions. What capacity should these caches have? Like maybe 32 gigs? Can I get away with?
So, for the ZIL, the ZIL is only used for synchronous writes, which are writes where the program is waiting until the write is done before it moves on. So depending on your workload, you might have 0 of those or very little of those, and therefore there's no advantage to having a ZIL. But databases and a bunch of other things do make use of those, and so it can be valuable. But yes, with a ZIL, you really don't need more than 32 gigs, probably even less than that. 8 is probably lots, especially for a home server.
Okay.
The L2 ARC, on the other hand, more is better, but there's a problem. The L2 ARC is basically, so you have the ARC, which is the adaptive replacement cache, which is the cache in RAM where ZFS keeps blocks you're using a lot so it doesn't have to read them from disk. When there's not enough RAM, it can move stuff from the ARC to the L2 ARC, which is an SSD or NVMe or something like that, so that it's still faster than getting it off the spinning hard drive.
Sure.
The problem is everything that's in the L2 ARC needs to have a reference in the ARC, right? Because when it goes to see, hey, do I have a copy of this in the ARC? If it doesn't, then it goes to disk. So in the ARC, it'll have a smaller header pointer saying, hey, that's over in the L2 ARC, go over there to get it. And it says where on the disk it is. The problem is that each of those takes space. So every block that's actually in the L2 ARC takes a bit of RAM. If your L2 ARC is big and the amount of RAM you have is kind of small, that means that almost all the RAM will be used pointing to the L2 ARC, and meaning you're not actually caching as much data in RAM. And since RAM is many times faster than even your SSD, sometimes you're better off having less fast cache than more slow cache, right? So you don't want you want your L2 ARC to be as big as possible, but you're kind of size bound by how much RAM you have.
Okay.
So if you have too much RAM, you can't have too much RAM. If you don't have enough RAM and too much L2 ARC, your RAM really is going to be wasted just pointing to the L2 ARC instead of actually caching things, and that will hurt your overall performance. So if you have less than 64 gigs of RAM, you probably don't need an L2 ARC at all, because you'd rather use all of the RAM you have caching files directly. And an L2 ARC only makes sense when it's not possible to put any more RAM in the machine.
All right.
With the E3, I think because that's a V3, the max RAM on that will be 32 gigs. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you could do an L2 ARC, but I don't know that it's that bad. The nice thing that kind of answers your other question about an L2 ARC is you can add and remove it. Because it's just the L2 ARC is read cache. If it breaks or goes away, it doesn't hurt anything. It just means, I have to go to the disk to get
that. Does answer his other question.
So, yeah, his other question is, can these be added after or removed? And the answer for both is yes. Although the ZIL, you have to be a little more careful removing it because there might be data on it that is expected to be written to the pool and hasn't been yet. But as long as the device doesn't fail, then yes, the remove command allows you to remove your L2 ARC and your ZIL. So you can experiment with them, and if it doesn't work out, you can take them out. So it's not a huge deal. But yeah, since that's a V3 Xeon E3, that's probably limited to 32 gigs, because I think it's the V4 or V5 before the max RAM goes up to 64 gigs on an E3. So with that little RAM, an L2 ARC probably doesn't make sense. And unless you're running a database or something, the ZIL might not make sense either, in which case you could just save the money and not buy an SSD. But if you want to experiment with it because you want to build a bigger one for work or something, but you want to try it at home and learn about how it works, it's perfectly fine to do so.
That's a good idea.
So answering the next question, can I get away with both of these just being partitions on the same SSD?
Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Oh.
Obviously, there's performance impact to that.
Okay.
But again, for just screwing around, it's perfectly fine. In the real world, you probably will end up wanting 2 different kinds of SSDs for these in production, whereas the ZIL is going to be very small and very, very high endurance because you can write to it all the time.
Sure.
Whereas the L2 ARC, that one's going to be a little bit more read heavy, although you are writing it. The nice thing is ZFS provides a throttle for that, so you can limit how much you're writing to it so that, if you buy an SSD that says it can handle this many terabytes of writes, and you tell ZFS don't write more than this many megabytes per second, you know that you're not going to wear out that drive too soon.
Okay. Now, what do you see as a question about encryption? He says, would it be rather...
We'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. So can the cache be added later? Yes. You can build the machine, use it, and then add or remove the L2 ARC and ZIL at any time.
Right.
And then he asks, how are they assigned? L2 ARC and ZIL are global per pool. You can turn both on or off per data set with other settings. So the L2 ARC is the secondary cache setting property for each data set. So you can turn on or off whether the L2 ARC is used, but you can't assign a specific L2 ARC to only be used for one data set or something like that. So the ZIL and L2 ARC are global to one individual pool, but you can control whether they're used or not per data set. But that's about all the control you have there.
Okay.
And then, so yeah, lastly, you asked about encryption. Would it be rather stupid to Lux encrypt all the pools, but have the contents in plain text in the caching storage? It depends what your goal is. Sometimes the only reason you're encrypting the drive at all, maybe the key sits in a plain text on a USB stick or on the SSD so the system can boot without a password. The only reason you're doing the encryption is so that when a drive fails, you can send it back for the warranty replacement without having to worry about the plain text data being on the disk because everything was encrypted. So sometimes it depends what your goal with the encryption is. But if you're using something like Geli, or if you're using Lux on the raw block device and then passing that block device into ZFS, I don't know how Lux works, so I can't answer that question specifically. But if you're doing something like Geli where you're providing a transparent block device that does the encryption for you to ZFS, then you can still do that for the L2 ARC and ZIL as well. Although, if your point is to be fast, encryption isn't necessarily fast. So that's, again, up to you.
Okay. He says, greetings from UTC +1. Are you ready for the next one, sir?
Sure.
Okay, so this one comes in from Computer Freak 33K, and he's just got some questions about backing up FreeNAS. I'm looking to set up FreeNAS server for a small business, and I was wondering what the best way to back up the data would be. One way I was thinking of doing this is setting up periodic snapshots for the data pool and then a replication task to replace the snapshots to a pool for backups. I was planning on having the backup drive part of the system as well, since they don't really have a budget for a dedicated backup server. And he kind of gives an example there with some tables. Is this a good way of backing up FreeNAS drives, or is there a better way of doing this? Thanks. What do you think, Alan?
So yeah, that the feature for all that is built into FreeNAS, although I think in FreeNAS, the GUI usually assumes that the backup pool is on a second server, but it can be on the first server for now and eventually go to a backup server later once they can have a second server or something. But yeah, ZFS likes to do this. That's a good way to do it.
Okay.
Right. And you can have all the data sets in the backup pool not be mounted or have the property read-only set, and that way data can never be changed. So if something does happen to the data pool, it doesn't happen to the backup pool. It doesn't help you in some cases, like if a lightning strike comes in and fries the power supply and breaks both set of hard drives because they're both plugged into the same power supply, or someone steals the server, or someone hacks into the server and gets root access and can just gpool destroy both pools. doesn't help you there, where remote server helps maybe a little bit more. But in general, that's a decent way to start doing it. But that is one replica, not necessarily a backup. So you might want to have backups as well, but it's a good first step.
Yeah. Good way to put that. JB Viewer 11 writes in, Alan, and he's been watching since before episode 1. He says, wow, I can't believe this is going to be the last show of Alan and Chris, episode 300. I remember when you and Alan, he's talking to me, were talking about a new show you were going to start. Alan was filling in for Brian at the time for last. You and I must have been just chatting on the live stream. He says, thanks for all the great things you and Alan shared with us to make us just a little smarter. You'll be missed from me, a.k.a. JB Viewer 11, in the chat room. Well, thank you, JB Viewer 11.
Yes, I know. A number of people that have been watching since the beginning.
Yeah.
But a lot of people that I introduced to it after, actually. Dan, who's going to replace me, is one of those. I told him about the podcast at BSD one year, and he subscribed via his iTunes or whatever and started watching it. He started watching at the current episode, but then was watching backwards all the way to episode 1,
Oof.
which I thought was interesting.
Watching us devolve.
It's not the same as, it's not the same as starting at 1 and going forward. In particular, you wanted the more recent news sooner, and then
yeah, sure.
I don't know. After I got more than a couple months behind, I would have started back at 1, but he went the other way.
Yeah.
But by next BSD he had a patch your shit shirt and was wearing it to the conference. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it's interesting too. There's folks that have been watching and listening since episode 1 that have never even stopped by the chat room. They've never logged into the IRC room. They've never emailed us. There's just so many people out there we don't hear from. In fact, if I checked by the last stats, if this, which I would imagine this, if anything, will probably do better than some of our than an average episode. But if this episode gets average downloads in 30 days, after 30 days of this episode being published, 117,000 people, 117,000 unique listeners will have downloaded this show. And we only hear from a small fraction of them. So I am so appreciative of those of you who have taken the time every now and then to write in or say hi. But I also appreciate those of you who just have time to listen. And we started this show with essentially no listeners. And over the 6 years, it's grown to something that's pretty amazing. Connor writes in. He says, thanks for the lessons. I'm a 17-year-old who's been listening to TechSNAP since about episode 100. I've thoroughly enjoyed every episode, and I want to thank both of you for teaching me so much. It's been entertaining and informative experience. Many thanks and best wishes to the future. In fact, thank you to everybody who sent in a ton of best wishes to Wes and Dan. People also already writing emails to Wes and Dan, which is awesome. Please keep those up.
Yes,
I really love seeing that. I really appreciate that.
That's one of the most fun things is answering the feedback, even though oftentimes they're hard questions or things I don't necessarily have the answer to. But especially on BSD Now, we do this as well. And oftentimes there are questions that I'm not the expert on that. But the next week we get an email from someone who is answering the question for somebody, which is great too. But the feedback is definitely the most interesting part of the show, just because I get to see what people actually have questions about. And helps me understand what part to explain. I remember, especially early on, when I really wasn't sure what people wanted out of TechSNAP. It was a lot harder to pick top stories. And then one feedback, somebody was like, what's the difference between like RAID 5 and RAID 6? And I turned it into like the half-hour thing on like what the different RAID levels are. And back then I wasn't even really into ZFS yet.
It's still very new.
Watching those old ones is weird.
Yeah, it was very new back then. Yeah, it really shows you that Wes and Dan will have their own trajectory too. It's so much changes over the first 20 weeks and then the first 100 weeks and then eventually you find your groove. You're usually around 200.
It's more.
Yeah. The audience.
I don't know. Some of those early episodes were the best ones, though.
You think so?
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, it depended on some metric. Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah.
Like the Ultimate Home Server.
Yeah.
What the RAID levels are.
Yeah.
A couple of the other ones were just different.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's fun because back then
some of those where it was we
were experimenting,
explaining an abstract concept rather than reporting the news. I think some of those I liked better.
Yeah.
But they're a bit more work to write as well.
And there's that, and there's sort of the practical aspect of doing it every single week. Sort of necessitates, You can't.
Yeah, and like war stories. Eventually, I ran out of stories.
Yeah. Yeah, and we could keep fishing for some, but it takes quite a bit. And I think also...
We had Irish Alan wrote in a bunch of war stories for us, and we used those.
Right.
For all entertainment.
Right. I think also one of the tricks to... I guess we can say this now, and then we'll move out of feedback. But I think we can officially give this kind of advice now that we're at 300 weeks without missing a beat. I think one of the things to a reliable, sustainable podcast is finding a happy, sustainable medium prep-wise. Because you can overdo it and then you burn yourself out, and you can underdo it and you don't get enough people listening or watching.
Yeah. Part of that was I found it. The audience didn't seem to notice the difference between when I spent like 10 hours and when I spent 4.
Kind of depends on the stories and what you have to say about them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Part of it is that, I got better at just formulating my opinion more quickly, I guess. But
right. Yeah, it does take a little better. Yeah, it does take a little bit to be able to do that.
And part of it is I learned to rely a little more on what I would come up with while we were just talking about it versus having to have all the points I wanted to make written down. Otherwise, I wouldn't be comfortable doing it. Mm-hmm. And part of it is I just got more comfortable, which I think helped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which you just learned by doing.
Yep.
So you can keep sending your questions in. Wes and Dan, fully qualified to answer, and they'll be looking for them. TechSNAP at jupiterbroadcasting.com or go over to the contact page. Thank you, everyone who sent in your best wishes and your encouragements to the future team as well. But with the feedback all done, it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. Welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that didn't fit at the top of the show, but we still want to give you a bunch of links after the show, and some of these links came from our intelligence agency over at TechSNAP.reddit.com. I believe this first one did, as a matter of fact. I hate these kinds of stories a little bit, because it's not really the best way to judge this kind of thing. But if you go by the CVEs, Android was the most vulnerable product of 2016. Android, then Debian Linux, then Ubuntu, then Flash.
Well, it's interesting that they're separating those two. Because
Debian
I'm
and
guessing
Ubuntu?
almost all the same CVEs would apply to one or the other.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. So there you go. Android, which...
But I'm guessing Firefox and Chrome are up high on that list.
Yeah, let's see here. Linux kernel is number 10, Chrome number 13, iPhone OS, I guess they mean iOS, is 15, Edge is 19. Where's Firefox?
That seems a lot different than previous years.
Yeah.
I know previous years it was like browsers and plugins. It was like Flash, Java. Like, how is Java not even in the top? Like, every quarterly release from Oracle had 50 plus security vulnerabilities. How did that not add up to being in this list?
Yeah. This is a weird list.
I don't know. Listing Windows multiple times just seems like that clutters the list a bit and screws up the rankings.
Yeah. So that's why I'm not a big fan of them.
Or like Acrobat DC, Acrobat Reader DC.
And to make sure that it's a classic episode of TechSNAP for episode 300, we have a Brian Krebs story in the roundup.
Yes.
The FTC's Internet of Things Challenge, huh?
Yeah, so the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S., is having a challenge to try to solve the IoT security system problem. With a reward of only $25,000. But so one of the biggest cybersecurity stories of 2016 was the surge in online attacks caused by poorly secured Internet of Things devices like routers, security cameras, and DVRs that say were used to attack Krebs. Many readers have commented about ideas on how to counter vulnerabilities caused by out-of-date software on IoT devices. So why not pitch the idea for money? And that's what the U.S. Federal Trade Commission is proposing. What they want to do is seeking ideas for a tool of some sort that would address the burgeoning IoT mess. The agency will offer a cash prize of $25,000 for the best solution and up to $3,000 for the 3 honorable mentions. The FTC said the ideal tool might be a physical device that a consumer can add to his or her home network that would check and install updates for other IoT devices on the home network. Or it might be an app or cloud-based service, or a dashboard or other user interface. Contestants have the option of adding features such as those that would address hard-coded, factory default, or easy-to-guess passwords. That kind of poses a couple of problems. I don't want that device on my network being able to update the firmware on that device on my network.
Okay.
Without some kind of
interaction?
verification.
Permission? Yeah.
Because otherwise, if somebody does hack the DVR can then overwrite the firmware on my thermostat with evil firmware.
All right, sure. Fair enough. Know? Yeah.
And then the hard-coded factory default or easy-to-guess passwords really should be solved by the IoT devices, not by a third device that does this. But yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
Honestly, I don't think the solution to the IoT mess is an extra IoT device that manages the security of all your other IoT devices.
All right.
In particular, if that means that all your IoT devices trust anything sent by this one IoT security device.
Yeah, I mean,
because then it becomes the single vector to taking over every IoT device.
I could see like these these Google Homes or the Echo products trying to be that role, maybe.
I can understand the Echo product updating all Amazon branded things or even just Amazon certified things. But
okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the solution I would like to work toward is more of a toolkit for building IoT that has a bunch of this stuff that's done wrong repeatedly done right, like a secure update mechanism available open source under a BSD license, and everybody just uses this one that doesn't have all the common mistakes in it.
And then they can patch their shit.
Of course, we'll find a problem in it, we'll fix it, and they'll still be using the 5-year-old one, and it won't really help. So it only goes so far, but it's better than what they're doing now, where everybody invents their own and does it wrong.
That is true. Wise words.
If you have some brilliant idea, why not get $25,000? Yeah. Although, if your idea is really that good, you can probably
get a lot more.
Do a startup around it and get a lot more than $25,000. But
maybe you start here, and that'll give you a little credibility. Maybe.
I don't know if the rules say that the FTC
if you can run
gets
with
the
it,
design, but I don't think so. So anyway,
this one's definitely for further reading after class, but this one sounded interesting. Ultrasounds can be used to de-anonymize Tor users. Ultrasounds emitted by ads or JavaScript code hidden on a page accessed through the Tor browser can de-anonymize Tor users by making nearby phones or computers send identity beacons back to advertisers. The attack model was brought to light towards...
the FBI has a bug on your phone, and then when you go via Tor, your laptop emits a sound you can't hear, but your phone can hear it, then the FBI knows that, hey, the person on Tor on this website right now
this person.
Has this
I can see
phone.
How they'd use that. Okay, all right. I can see that could be useful. All right, a clever Facebook hack reveals private email addresses of any user?
Yes, so a researcher found a way to go to Facebook, pick any random person, and find out what their email address is. He submitted it via the Facebook bug bounty program and made $5,000.
Well, all right. There's another making a little bit of money there. There's obviously some hype going for talks, but hackers, this is the Register's headline, hackers could turn your smart meter into a bomb and blow your family to smithereens. That's literally the headline.
So my electric meter, which is a smart meter, probably not. There's not really anything explosive. However, the gas meter might be able to do something weird, like let in more gas than I was asking for.
So this here, I guess maybe that might be what it is. They say the software vulnerability, this different team's been looking into it. They're going to talk about it, I think, at the 33rd.
That was last weekend.
Okay, so that's where this came from. I see. They say the attacker who controls the meter also controls the software, allowing them to initially blow the meter up. That's what he said at the Chaos Communications Congress earlier this month. If the attacker could hack your meter, he could give access to all the devices connected to the meter. If the smart meter network is in its current state, it is completely exposed to attacks. I guess there's something in there. I guess there's something in there with the fuse or something like that he says could start a fire. But
I suppose mine's on the outside of my house and surrounded by bricks, so maybe it'll be okay.
Seems like yeah.
Well, one of the problems with some of these smart meter systems is instead of trying to connect each one to the network, which would be very expensive. They kind of daisy chain. So mine is connected to the network, and the neighbor talks to mine and to the next neighbor over and over and over, and it goes a bunch of hops so that only like every 10th house actually needs to be connected to the network. And then, 10 houses on either side of, or 5 houses on either side of me jump back to my house. Meaning that the meter at my neighbor's house has to somehow, at least somewhat, trust my meter. And so if you compromise them, it can mean it's very wormable.
All right. So this next one's from Schneier. A SQL injection attack is illegal. A SQL injection attack is a legal company name in the UK. Oh, I see.
Yes. So a company just registered their company name in the UK as ; space drop table in quotes companies semicolon dash dash limited.
All right. They get the clever. They get the lulls for the week. They get
with the obligatory XKCD.
So this is, I'm sure, nothing to worry about. I guess New York City is badgering Uber to get company data on where it's taking its users in New York. They want to piece together the full details of every trip you take. Several independent privacy experts have said this policy creates serious privacy risks. I wonder why. That's kind of creepy. And of course, Uber has that data, so they're going to eventually have to give it over to somebody. Did you hear about ad nauseum, Alan? You got banned.
Put it in the roundup.
That was my clever transition, Alan. I was tossing it to you.
I'd never heard of it before today, though.
I hadn't either.
So anyway, there's this Chrome extension called ad nauseum, and what it actually does is hides every ad with a tracking cookie that it sees, but also simulates a click on it, so that the tracking data will be so muddled from you basically clicking every ad, that it'll really mess up the tracking data. Plus, because they're fake clicks, advertisers are paying for these and not actually getting anything out of it.
That's what's really going to piss somebody off.
So it's driving up the price of ads and hurting the ad network. So Google has kicked this ad out of the Chrome store and blocked even installing it manually. You can see why, because Google, as an advertising network, doesn't really like fake ad clickers and so on. However, the reason they cited from the an ad clicker is actually not against the terms of service of the Google Chrome App Store.
That surprises
Google Chrome's reason for kicking the ad out was that it had purposes beyond the stated one or something. The extension was doing something rather than what it said on the tin. And so ad nauseum has tried to repackage itself to explain better what exactly it's doing and trying to get back in the store and see what Google says.
Yeah. We'll see.
I can understand if Google wants to kick them out, but if they do, they have to admit the reason why, not make one up. So,
I wonder if Firefox would have any problem. Is it on Firefox? It might already be on Firefox, I suppose.
Yeah. I think they do have a Firefox one, and Mozilla doesn't necessarily have a dog in that particular fight. And
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so this is a classic. MongoDB databases was held for ransom by a mysterious attacker for 0.2 Bitcoin.
Yeah. So turns out at least 1,800 MongoDBs are out on the internet with no logins.
God damn it. No.
Not even a default password, but just don't even require one.
No, stop it.
So somebody made a bot that goes down, downloads all the data.
Of course they did.
And deletes it all.
Yes.
And replaces it with a table called warning saying, hey, pay me my 0.2 Bitcoins, which is about $200 right now, and I'll give you your data back.
It's like a public service.
Yeah. Except apparently some U.S. healthcare organization had 200,000 patient records of some kind in it. I'm not sure exactly what data.
Oh, no.
I'm not sure what data, but yeah, it's like that seems like a HIPAA violation, having a MongoDB out on the internet with no login at all, let alone a bad password.
Don't worry about HIPAA. Just blame the Russians. The Russians put it on the internet. It's fine. It's fine.
Right. Anyway, so yeah, that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Also, notice how Chris skipped a story because it was actually identical. You have the same link in here twice.
Yeah, well, see, I smoothly skipped it so no one would have noticed.
But I don't want them to know that you didn't. You screwed up. They should know.
What? Oh, I put that. Oh, I thought we just both put the same story in. That's what I thought.
No, you put the same one in twice.
Oh, it was important. So important. We should talk about it again. Actually, instead of talking about that, you and I think we're both speculating this would happen. No surprise, Verizon executives reportedly unsure whether the Yahoo deal will get done after all of the hack reports.
I would say it was a good opportunity for them to get it really cheap. They could basically just lower the price enough until Yahoo says no, and then it's not their fault.
Yeah, I suppose so. Okay, well, maybe they'll pay Verizon. Just take us, please. Just take us. Basically, if they just throw in daycare for Marissa, maybe they'll just go for it. Yeah, that's you can't. What are you gonna expect? Don't try this at home. How not to use Etsy sudoers? Is that what this is basically?
This is actually basically a war story. So.
Oh yeah. Oh good.
Fix automation with sudo with not using vi sudo to edit the config file. Introduce a syntax error, and now your Ansible can't sudo in order to update your sudoers file to fix the problem.
Oh boy.
What's wrong with that?
That should be a good read.
Yeah. If you want to lock yourself out of 200 computers at once, you're going to need some automation.
Oh, this makes me laugh. For I think it's Forza Horizon 3 update. It accidentally published an unencrypted build of the game. Oops.
Yep. So some people who were updating the game suddenly found they were downloading 53 gigabytes. So I'm guessing this is not just the actual release build, but some like developer stuff and art assets and probably every version of the texture rather than one. And, possibly there could be some source code type stuff in there. I'm not sure.
I would imagine, right? Oh, wow.
But yeah, one developer accidentally published 2 or 3 versions newer of the game, which basically spoiled a bunch of secret things they were working on. But also, anybody who played the game, their save file has now been updated to the new version, and they can't go back to an old version.
Oh, that sucks.
So some of the they're encouraging people that happen to not to go back and start a fresh game and overwrite their save file. See, this is one of the things I hate: games where you don't control the save files, and they don't version it.
Yeah,
it's like if you're going to save for me, sure, but I want separate save files for at least the last 10 saves or something.
Yeah,
so that if something goes screwy, I can just go back one save instead of having to start over.
Exactly, absolutely. So ThreatPost has 4 new normals for 2017, and I would argue these are
basically, this is their predictions for what 2017 is going to be about.
Yeah, but I feel like this is what 2016 was already about.
Well, some of the IoT botnets didn't really take off until the end of 2016.
Ransomware, though, that feels like that was pretty solid.
Anyway, their list is ransomware. We're going to see more than that. We've seen a lot, but it's going to keep evolving. We've seen it recently start extending into TVs and stuff.
Yeah, we have something about that in a bit.
And then IoT botnets, if we thought the one with the video cameras or the one with the routers was big, just wait till the next one. You don't know what happens until somebody's fridge is attacking you. or you start getting phone calls. Is your fridge running? It's like, yes. It's like, well, it's denial of service attacking me, so unplug it.
Yeah, that's good. That's the new joke.
Bug bounties. This is a good thing on the list. We're going to see even more bug bounty programs because it's a way to get researchers to consider telling the vendor rather than not, but also a way to get people who want to do this. You can make a living by doing bug bounties if you can do enough of them. You know what?
Actually, looking back at it now, 2016 was the year we saw even Apple start a series of bug bounties. They're kind of doing their own thing. I don't know how.
But also, we saw things like HackerOne where you don't have to try to run your own program. You can just farm that out.
And then you get reps and a bit of a social network around it, too.
Mm-hmm. And then 2017 will also be the year of bug buying. This is where the government or bad guys or just anybody buy up the vulnerabilities. Don't you feel like not everybody participates in the bug bounties. If I find a really good exploit and the bug bounty for it from Facebook is $5,000, but some other national government will pay me many extra zeros on top of that, I'm going to sell it to them.
This has been going on for years.
Yes. So there's both. The government buying vulnerabilities so that nobody will talk about them and they don't get fixed and the government can use them, or the government buying exploits that somebody else found, hoping that nobody else knows about them for a while so they continue to use them to exploit people. Both of those happen, and it means the bugs don't get fixed, which is bad. So there's been efforts to try to make the government stop doing this or be completely transparent about it. And it'd be really good if, the NSA had to have Microsoft fix any bug they find within a certain amount of time or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. It's a good read, and it's up at ThreatPost if you guys want to check it out. Link in the show notes. A programmer has found a way to liberate ransomware Google Smart TVs. Remember?
Yeah, although he didn't find it, he got LG to tell him, so it's not.
Yeah, this is sort of like a part 2 of a story that was really a 3-part story. First part was ransomware on the television, and LG refused to help him reset it. Then he got a little publicity. LG capitulated, helped him reset it, and now is sort of
how to do it if it happens to you.
All right, I love it.
So apparently this hack, not even the LG support people knew about previous to this. But basically, if you hold the setting button and then hold the channel down, is it? And then let go of the first button and then the second button, it will factory reset. And,
the official procedure: with the TV powered off, place one finger on the settings symbol, then another finger on the channel down symbol. Remove finger from settings, then from channel down, and navigate using volume keys to wipe data /factory reset option. There you go. So if you get stuck with it, that's how you do it. Link in the show notes.
It seems like this TV has a dual firmware type setup or something, in particular, this firmware is not persistent. But it actually, that kind of harkens back to the Schneier article we were talking about, or just the comments on the IoT FTC thing, is that a lot of these devices, unlike higher end devices that say when you want to do a firmware update, have two firmwares in them. So there's like the active one and inactive one, and every time you update, it overwrites the older of the two. Or some of them are just like it has the original one, and then the one you keep updating, such that if the power goes out in the middle of updating and you brick the firmware, it can boot off the old firmware enough to get you up and let you reflash again.
Right.
But some of these cheaper IoT devices are like, well, why spend money on two sets of flash when we can have just one? But it means if the power goes out or something goes wrong during the flashing and you've only written it, the device can't boot.
Although they have a solution for that too. They just don't bother patching them and updating them. Then they don't have that problem.
It's like, for example, my Onion Omega only has the one, but it has the ability for me to go into U-boot, the bootloader, basically before it even boots off the firmware, and TFTP boot and do it.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have that, but like on the D-Link or the TP-Link router I bought, I had to solder on my own serial port in order to get access to that.
And then the other issue too is after a certain age, they may not have anything to FTP into. So I have a couple of different devices that do that. They can self-check online. They have a little boot environment they go into.
This one's TFT, like it Pixie boots basically.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So these devices actually have separate firmware. They boot into that separate firmware, and then they connect out to an FTP server and download the image. Same for my DJI Phantom.
Well, actually, most interestingly, my keyboard, the old one, the Razer Black Widow.
Yeah.
When I started having problems with this, I actually found out that if you hold, I forget which two keys, something in spacebar, as you plug in the USB, it will boot into a different mode where it's set up to receive firmware. And then you can flash firmware onto it to update the firmware in the keyboard. Kind of similar thing, except for it's not reaching out to the internet to get it. It's just only then is it in a mode to receive firmware from the computer. Interesting thing about that is it means it's slightly more protected from the idea that a virus on your computer stashes itself in the firmware on your keyboard or something, so it can reinfect you. Because it only accepts new firmware when you've booted it in a special mode, and then you have to unplug it and plug it back in to get back into regular mode.
This is I don't know. You tell me. For a surprisingly
you have to click on the images to actually read the story. But
for a surprisingly cynical, evidence-seeking audience, how come y'all aren't calling out this sort of sloppy analysis? And he pulls it up, and it's got highlighted text here. He says, part of the evidence supporting Russian government involvement in the DNC and related hacks, including the ones in Germany and France.
German's
TV.
Bundestag is a police.
It stemmed from the assumption that X-Agent malware was exclusively developed and used by Fancy Bear. We now know that's false, and the source code has been obtained by others outside of Russia. I think that's a huge thing.
Go to the second image.
Okay.
The other places, there's like just a random developer, ESET, the antivirus company, has managed to get the full source code for the Linux version of it.
Huh.
Yeah, so ESET was able to obtain the complete source code for X-Agent for the Linux OS with a compilation date of July 2015. So their copy maybe is not the newest, but they have the source code. They could make their own version of X-Agent, and then so it could be them. Or a hacker known as RUH8, aka Sean Townsend, with the Ukrainian Cyber Alliance, has informed me that he has also obtained the source code for the X-Agent for Linux. If both a security company and a hacker collective have the X-Agent source code, then so do others. And attributions to, say, APT28 or Fancy Bear or GRU-based solely upon the presumption that they're the only people using X-Agent are therefore not provable.
Yeah, that's huge, don't you think?
Yeah.
That's sort of that sort of cuts out the support of the entire attribution to Russia.
Right. And if you look at was it Grizzly Step or whatever the
report?
Americans
I read.
Most of the Russians they faced sanctions against were people they were after for other things.
Yes.
Not even related to cyber anything.
Right. And they didn't sanction Putin, which is maybe not too surprising. But if they did say it was supposedly directed by the top. Yeah, the whole thing's pretty weak. It's pretty disappointing. They also put out a report.
So the chat room, who made X-Agent? We know that the Russians made X agent.
Yeah. Or it was
but
that
at
Ukraine.
this point, they're not the only people that still have it.
Well, wasn't it a Ukrainian army member that made it? Didn't you say last week?
No. That was the software that X agent was implanted into. X agent is the
right. It went into that app that was used to monitor.
They applied X agent onto his artillery app.
Yeah, right. Gotcha.
So we know the Russians made X agent, but now they've been using it so much that antivirus companies have it, random hackers have it, other people have it.
Right.
So the fact that they used X agent doesn't automatically prove it was the original people who made it.
In fact,
it was like,
you could argue
that hack was done with Linux, so therefore it was all Torvalds.
Right. You could argue that if you wanted to intentionally make it look like the Russians, you would intentionally use X agent. Just saying. Putting that out there.
Although you would just probably plant more obvious clues.
Just frying some bacon.
But in this particular case, if the reason you're saying it was the Russians is because they used X agent and nobody else has it, that's obviously wrong.
Yeah. I think your Linux analogy is kind of good, actually. Wow. That's a big deal. And kind of to bookend that, it turns out, this is from The Hill, that the FBI never actually investigated any of the DNC servers themselves. They've just simply gone off of the report. That I can't remember if it was FireEye or who it was, but it was, they were hired by the DNC to look into this. So they just basically went off the report of the DNC contractor and didn't do any investigation on their own. And then when they... the FBI specifically, him and hawed the longest about doing attribution. But how could they?
What's interesting? So actually, the guy who tweeted the X agent thing had a different tweet the other day, and it was like, why doesn't the FBI do its own cyber intelligence or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. It's like 2015, FBI accidentally locks itself out of suspect's iPhone. 2016, FBI hires a company to hack into the iPhone for them. 2017, why does the FBI not do it themselves? It's like, because they're hapless and they lock themselves out of stuff when they try. They don't have the expertise.
It was CrowdStrike. So there was CrowdStrike was hired by the DNC to investigate the hack, and the FBI just went with their report. I guess
CrowdStrike was the people who identified Fancy Bear in this artillery thing as well.
I would say maybe if the FBI doesn't have to investigate it themselves, because that does rely. Although you would hope they would have that expertise, but they could hire another contractor, an independent contractor.
In this case, it's because there's not going to be necessarily a court case about it. But in general, the police have to get at least clones of usually the original hard drives and give the DNC back cloned versions of those drives as evidence. But because there's not necessarily going to be a trial here, I suppose they don't actually do that. But it just seems
It feels like, though, when you're making such grave accusations on the world stage against a world power, you'd really want to just maybe double check your work. Just maybe.
Yeah, maybe it's an independent verification or something.
Yeah, maybe spend a few less millions on cracking iPhones and kick a couple $100,000 over to...
the main reason... we haven't really dug into the whole DNC thing and so on in this show is the same reason Krebs hasn't. So if you go over to Krebs' website, he has an article currently about why he hasn't really got into that mess.
What do you say? That sounds interesting.
There's not really any interesting reporting to do because nobody has any more information than anybody else, so he can't really investigate.
Everything just cites officials.
Doing his own research, not just using other people's data.
Good for him.
But, no matter what you say, you're either going to be lumped in as, on one side or the other of the two, and it's not really going to go anywhere. Anyway, he has a good article about that, and I'm using that as my excuse as well.
I like that. I think that's a good call. All right, so another tweet from the same gentleman, the guru.
This is an old one, though. So this is an old Russian spy story, and it's quite hilarious. But basically, the Russians had the thing. So back when it was still the Soviet Union, and they had, they were spying on the U.S. from their embassy and so on in New York and so on. They had a little, like a cottage out near Washington, on the Potomac River or whatever. And whenever they had anything electronic, any kind of spy gear, the rule was they had to smash it and send the smashed bits back in the diplomatic pouch on a plane back to Russia. And even if they wanted to buy something like a tape recorder, they had a weird system where they buy it in New York or whatever, and then ship it to Moscow, and somebody else would buy one in Paris, and they would end up with each other's, so that it would mess up with they couldn't be tricked into buying one that the FBI had bugged and used. The FBI would end up bugging some other random thing. Although in the end, it's like, wouldn't the Russians want one that make sure that none of them were bugged? But anyway, that was one of their security procedures. Anyway, but all the generals that got to go to this little cottage or whatever always wanted to go out on the river on a boat, but they never. The Russians wouldn't buy a boat for the generals to go, partying or whatever. But eventually, the one intelligence officer convinced him to buy a boat so he could drive out into the middle of the river or the ocean there and dump electronics into the river to destroy them, because it was costing them like $200 a pound or whatever to ship the broken electronics back to Russia for destruction.
Damn.
Anyway, it's a really interesting story. It's a couple of pages long, so I don't want to read the whole thing, but it's definitely worth checking out because it's quite funny.
I love that. I'm going to follow this guy on Twitter. This is a great. I assume you must be following him for a while.
Yeah,
I've followed. What's the story about the Barbie typewriter? What kind of nightmare machine is this, Alan?
So this is an old-fashioned typewriter. It's an electronic one, but basically you put paper in it and you type, and it makes like letters on paper. But it's basically a company in like Slovenia, was it? I forget what the name. I forget which country, but an Eastern European country made this electronic typewriter and was selling it. And then the Mattel people got wind of it, and they basically changed it. If you look at the picture, you see the one that's kind of like gray with the blue knobs. So they had made this little electronic typewriter kind of toyish thing. And then they sold it to Mattel, and Mattel like Barbieized it. But they kept the same circuit boards and firmware inside of it.
Oh, interesting.
And it turns out that there's a function built into it to do encryption. So if you hit Shift Lock 1, 2, 3, or 4, you type a message in, and encrypted message comes out, and then somebody else with this typewriter sets to the same key, types the encrypted message, and it will type out on the typewriter the decrypted message.
You're telling me this Barbie typewriter has a badass encryption decryption system built into it?
I wouldn't say badass. It's
okay.
4 static keys.
I still think that's pretty cool, dude.
Fairly substitution based, but yes.
I think that's actually
if
great.
If you scroll down a little bit, it actually shows what the algorithm is and so on. But.
No. That is funny. Look, they have multiple models. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, so it's pretty simple, but that's pretty great.
This is how so you just shift lock 1, 2, 3, 4 for encrypting, 5, 6, 7, 8 for decrypting, and those correspond to the 4 different keys, or, lock shift 12 to turn off the encryption. But if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see, you can see that, when you type an A with key 1, it prints I.
Yeah.
Or if it's key 2,
cool.
it'll print a T and so on.
So
the numbers, a 0 becomes a 5 or a 6 or a 7 or 8, depending on the key. So the numbers aren't encrypted very well, but.
I tell you what, sometimes a girl's just got to make sure her communications are private.
So the Mattel decided that little girls wouldn't be that interested in secret messages. It's like, really?
Yeah.
Encrypt your diary and your little brother can't read it or whatever.
But, I'm not going to lie. I kind of want one of these typewriters right now.
The Barbie version never mentioned the encryption feature at all. But if you happen to have one, because it's the same as the original version, it works.
I kind of want one. That's just sort of great. It's my daughter Abby's birthday today. This would have been a good gift. Right there.
I don't know how hard these are to come by nowadays.
I bet they're going to become a lot harder now that
I
story's
imagine they're relatively robust. It's a typewriter. But
yeah. I kind of just want a typewriter. I have no idea what I'd use it for. Now I kind of want one. My grandpa used to have this really cool one in a suitcase. You'd open it up and have the chunk levers, and if you type too fast, it would jam.
Yes, but if you remember when we talked about the Russians building the typewriters so they could spy on people. That
was such a great story. That's a classic time. And, maybe one day we'll hear stories about stuff that they did today. I wanted to maybe...
Big Rug's been extracting a bunch of those. I don't know where he gets it, but it's good stuff. So
I am going to.
There's cool stuff in there.
So why not end the roundup for episode 300 with another kind of retro thing? Remember we used to do the Bitcoin Blaster on a regular basis on this show?
Yep.
Well, let's give Bitcoin one last mention during our reign. Over the last few days, it's been flirting over 1,000. As we record right now, it's at $998.90. Not that I'm watching. And it has been bouncing all around. Got up to $1,100 recently. So it's back up. The Bitcoin rally is back.
Then was down to $400, and it's all over the place.
Yeah, I think actually today it got as low as 902 for a bit.
With how long it's been around, we kind of expected it to get more stable, and it really hasn't.
Yeah.
There's still far too much speculation.
Yeah, my long term for Bitcoin is not as positive as it used to be, but my short term for Bitcoin has been. I have used this opportunity while the Bitcoin is high to just have more purchasing power to pick up a couple of things.
Don't remind me about the fact that I had 40 Bitcoins.
I know.
And I sold them when they were
remember when my exchange got hacked? Remember that? That happened on the show.
I know. You lost
like a lot.
But that was your fault. Why
I know.
Putting your coins in here, random person, hold my coins for me.
You know, well, the thing was we had a lot of people back then asking about the service, and I thought, well, I'll try it out for a little while, and that's what happened. And I want to say it might have been. I'm probably wrong, but it might have been somewhere around 40 Bitcoins that got stolen. It was a lot of Bitcoin. It's rough. It's rough. But it's been interesting watching it again, and it sort of reminded me of the old days of the TechSNAP program. But that is our last roundup story, Mr. Jude.
Yep.
And that brings us to the end of episode 300. Thank you, everybody, for watching this show and hanging out with us. Please stay subscribed. Please keep checking and give Wes and Dan a chance and see how they do. And come back every single week and give them your feedback, your comments, and your support. We very much appreciate it. And if you'd like, we'd also appreciate you sharing this episode with a friend and help spread the word about TechSNAP and give them a nice boost. Is there anything else we need to mention before we get out of here?
No. I think we've come to an end of quite an era.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Alan, for all of the extremely hard work and the great, awesome, unbreakable dedication that you had to this show. I appreciate it, and I know the audience really appreciates it.
So many Thursdays.
Yeah. And of course, you can keep
the hoops I've wrapped my life through to make sure that Thursday stayed free.
You really can't quite conceive what kind of commitment it is. You'd think, well, once a week is not a big deal, but so much like I've gone through children births, I've gone through divorce, I've moved around, like so much has happened in that 6 years, and it means making sure that every Thursday I carve out a little bit or a lot of time for this show, regardless of what's going on, and that's a massive commitment. So I know we all really appreciate it. And
it's one of those things about finding the time, but it's
and
just
people kept, I think one of the reasons people kept tuning in. I mean, I think it really helped to the success of the show.
One of the reasons for the success is the fact that you could reliably tell that the show is always going to be there. Whereas other, certain other people's podcasts that have tried to start, and then it's like, well, we need this week off, and next week it'll be on a different day, and then we're just going to be off for a couple of months, and then maybe we'll be back. And it's like, that's not the same thing. You're not doing it right.
That's rough. Yeah, that's rough. It's been, consistency is important. So thank you, everybody. I mean, we really appreciate you guys tuning in. Don't forget, you can keep following Alan on BSD Now. You can follow him on Twitter.
TechSNAP's not over. Tune in next week. There'll be a whole show.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, why don't I sign it off with that? I usually say we'll see you next week, but instead what I'll say is thanks so much for tuning in this week's episode of TechSNAP, and TechSNAP will see you right back here next week.